Welcome to the linguistics course at Southern Utah University. This video is going to focus on language preservation and policy. The three questions that we'll try to answer is why do we need to preserve languages? What are and how are languages preserved? And lastly, what is language policy and how does it affect language preservation? Why do languages need to be preserved? We should probably start here because we wouldn't have to preserve languages unless there was some kind of history or cultural factors or political factors that are resulting in the loss of language. And most often this happens through things like colonial history, where one country that speaks different languages moves into a region where there are indigenous languages spoken, and the colonizing country imposes its language on the local culture, sometimes disallowing them from speaking that language or teaching it to their children. And so as a result, languages can be lost through these sort of political forces. Another way that languages can be lost is through intercultural communication. We think about English as a global language of trade and business, communication, education. And so more and more people want to learn English, and as they do this, they may abandon other languages in favor of a language that has more of a political or financial advantage. Another reason why languages might be lost is through language hegemony. And this refers to the idea that some languages have more authority or power in a region. This may be related to a colonial history. It could be related to the idea of trying to pursue more intercultural communication. But sometimes one language within a country gains the political or authority power in the country, and therefore pushes that it be used as the common language or as the powerful language. And so people may abandon, whether willingly or through force of policies or other actions, to abandon minority languages in favor of this other language that has much stronger power in the country. And lastly is just the idea of attitudes towards multilingualism. Sometimes people are immigrants that come from a minority or an endangered language culture. They move to a country where a majority or more powerful language is used, and they feel like, well, we just got to learn the language of the home country or this new country, and they abandon the other language instead of having the idea that actually speaking multiple languages is a good thing. And we should become a multilingual society with multilingual speakers. And if multilingualism isn't valued, then speakers of a language might gravitate towards just speaking one language. So why do we care about whether languages are lost? Estimates say that there's hundreds of languages that get lost each year around the world. Well, we care about this because there is cultural knowledge that's embedded with languages. When a language is lost, then that cultural knowledge is lost as well. Languages have unique aspects in terms of vocabulary and grammar and other things that tell us not just about the linguistic aspects of that society or community, but also their values and their customs. And so when the language is lost, we lose a lot of that cultural heritage as well. These languages bring with them unique perspectives on ecosystems, on cultural traditions, on human interactions with other humans, but also with the world. And so when that language is lost, we lose these understandings about how humans interact with each other and the world. And if we lose languages, we're losing the societal or community identity of the people who speak these languages. That's an important part, as we've talked about learning a language, is gaining an identity as that language speaker. And so when that language is lost, part of a person's identity is also lost. So what are some ways that linguists use to preserve minority or endangered languages? One of them is encouraging people to speak those languages, encouraging parents or grandparents to speak those languages with their families, to teach the next generation that language, to use it in the home, to use it in the community. We encourage linguists to reach out to speakers of these languages, conduct interviews with them, help them explain vocabulary, record 2 or more native speakers of the language having conversations with each other so we can see what conversations in this language sound like. What is the rhythm of the conversation? How does turn taking happen? How do they interact with one another? All these kinds of recordings and transcripts are really important. And then taking that language knowledge and putting in online repositories so that people have a record of it and can study it and learn about it. We can start having linguists analyze the language. What are the different types of pronunciation, the phonology of the language? What is the syntax of the language? And all these other aspects of languages that we've studied. Once we have these evidences of the language, we can create these records. And another way we can preserve a language is establishing language education programs. So whether we're taking an endangered language and saying we're going to teach this in the schools or primary schools, or we say, let's make a university degree about these minority languages. And it's not just a linguistic aspect, it's also a cultural aspect and a historical aspect. And we establish language programs that encourage people to study and learn about and value these languages. So those are all different kinds of ways that linguists can help preserve endangered languages. So this gets into the idea now of language policy. And language policy is programs, laws, cultural norms, attitudes, any of these things that impact how languages are used in a society. And this is, to me, a very interesting topic. And it's something that, again, isn't covered in all linguistic courses, but it's a really important aspect of applied linguistics. And I remember a few years ago attending a conference on language assessment and testing. And in that conference were some people who came from cultures and countries that were multilingual. And they talked about some of the challenges, but the importance of having good language policy in their countries so that certain languages weren't favored more than others, all languages had equal chance, but how this is a very difficult political climate to work with because language is so tied to identity that the idea of multilingualism in some countries is very difficult. Let's take a look at some case studies of language policy both in the past and in the present and their impacts. So one of them, here's a picture of First Nations children from Canada. Obviously this picture is 100 years old, but what's happening in this picture is maybe not even 100 years old, it's even less than that. In Canada, on the reservations for First Nations people, many Indigenous children were taken from their families and put in what were called residential schools, where they were taught in English, they were taught essentially white European, Canadian values and language. And the idea here was intentionally to separate them from their parents and their grandparents so that they would not learn the language of their parents and their grandparents. It was done with, I guess, the intention to try and help them integrate better into white society. But it was really a horrible thing where they were pulled away from their culture, from their identity, and because of this, many Indigenous languages in Canada are endangered now. Many of the younger generation, and we're talking people, baby boomers, can't even speak those languages. So many of those languages are endangered today because of these types of policies that tried to favor the colonial language rather than the Indigenous languages. Here is a picture of the school where I taught when I taught in China. This is Xinzhou Shiyuan Zhongshui. It is a middle, kind of a private public partnership middle school. And this is when the school first opened. Actually, what you see is the field there turned into the athletic field. There's a track there. My apartment that I lived in is where those trees are. But I really loved working at this school. And as I was working at this school, I would sometimes walk through the administration building there where my office was, and I noticed there were some signs posted in every hallway. And it was the same sign, and I asked one of the native Chinese speakers, what are these signs about? Because I could only recognize the word Mandarin or Chinese, Putonghua, in the sign, and I didn't understand the rest. And she told me Those signs are in the school because many of the children who come to study at the school come from rural towns where they speak other dialects of Chinese. And they're told in the school you can only speak Putonghua, which is the Mandarin or the national dialect, and they are not allowed to speak their local dialect in the schools. And the idea behind this policy is to try and create a unified atmosphere at the school where all the teachers and students can understand one another because they're all speaking the same language. But at the same time, it almost gets back to this residential school idea that you are cut off from your native dialect and you are told this is the dialect you have to speak. And because it's the dialect of Beijing, where the government is, that's the dialect everyone is told they have to speak, even though it is not their native language, and it may not be as easy for them to communicate in that language. There's some good intentions behind the policy, but again, it's really favoring this monolingual kind of attitude that there's one language that everyone should be speaking, and it's not really being open to the idea of multilingualism. Here is a picture of a Hawaiian immersion program in the state of Hawaii. Similar to what happened in many places around the world, Hawaii used to have one of the most literate populations in the world before it became part of the United States. Kingdom of Hawaii was big on education. Almost every child could read, write, and speak Hawaiian. But when Americans took over, there was big pressure to eliminate the teaching of Hawaiian, and all children were told to only speak English. And as a result, Hawaiian almost disappeared. Now the state has policies for Hawaiian immersion programs, and children can be taught in school in Hawaiian. Some of these programs are Hawaiian only. And like a friend of mine who's from New Zealand, and she's Maori, similar thing happened in New Zealand where they started implementing these Maori immersion programs. And there were some concerns with those programs that because the children only went to school and learned Maori at school, they were not also learning English, which was a language that had advantages within the wider community. So in my opinion, these programs are really important. They're probably more successful when they're kind of a dual immersion program where the students gain communication and academic language in both languages, both in the indigenous language and whatever the language is of the community. I remember being at an airport in Maui once when I lived in Hawaii, and there was a mother who was speaking to her children. Some of them were school age, a couple teenagers, in Hawaiian to all of them. And they mostly kind of wouldn't talk back at her or just give one-word answers. Well, as soon as mother went to go get some food, the children and their father all immediately turned to English and started speaking with each other. So I think the mother really wanted to promote Hawaiian native language, but I think there are some challenges with these programs. So that's the need for the policy, right, is to really promote it and help people understand that there's value in this other language, but also recognize that they're living in a culture where that language isn't the language of everyday communication, and so that there may be a need and a desire to become proficient in both languages. I also wanted to talk briefly about the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. So the European Union has taken a stance and adopted policies to promote and value regional or minority languages within countries. So there are countries that have a national language, but then even though we all outsiders think of that as being one unified language, within that country there could be many different dialects or other regions that have different languages within that country. And so European Union has set forth some standards to try and promote and preserve these languages in their countries, whether that's through allowing the languages to be taught in the school or providing government resources in multiple languages so that one language isn't favored over the others. And other countries also deal with these kinds of challenges and how to give equal status to multiple languages within a region. So in our video, we talked about the need to preserve endangered languages and some methods that can be used to do that. We also talked about language policy and how educational and government leaders can have a big impact on what languages are learned and valued within a society.